The candle on the table burned low, and Alina Hartley did not notice it. Her eyes were fixed on the letter in her hand, and her fingers were shaking so hard that the paper made a small dry sound, like a leaf caught in wind. She had been invited to the royal salon, not as a guest, as a companion seated in the back row, meant to be quiet and small and forgettable. But the letter said something else. It said the topic of the evening would be Latin translation, judged in front of the entire room, in front of men who had spent their whole lives being told they were the smartest people breathing. Alina set the letter down. Her hands did not stop shaking. Her brother Edmund walked into the room, still in his school clothes, his shoes worn through at the toe. He looked at her face and stopped in the doorway. "You look like you have seen a ghost," he said. "Worse," Alina said. "I have been invited to a party." Edmund almost laughed, but something in her voice held him back. He came closer and picked up the letter, reading it twice. "The Duke of Rothmere," he said slowly. "Everyone says he destroys people at these things. He picked apart a professor from Cambridge last spring. The man left the room in tears." "I know. And they invited you." "They invited me to sit in the back and say nothing," Alina said. "I do not think anyone expects me to speak at all." Edmund studied her. He knew his sister better than anyone alive. He knew the look on her face was not fear. It was something colder and steadier than fear. "You are going to speak anyway," he said. "Are you not?" Alina did not answer him. She looked instead at the shelf behind him, at the stack of papers held together with string, her father's unfinished translation, the one she had been working on every night for almost a year. Every page of it was proof that she understood Latin better than most men who had degrees hanging on their walls. But proof on paper meant nothing in a room full of people who had already decided who was allowed to be clever. She stood up and reached for her coat. "Get some rest," she told her brother. "Tomorrow I am going to a party I was never supposed to attend, and I intend to leave it exactly the way I arrived, on my own terms." Edmund did not sleep well that night, and neither did she, but for very different reasons. The next evening, the townhouse where the salon was held glowed with candlelight from every window. Carriages lined the street. Alina arrived on foot, her one good dress brushed clean, her chin held level even as her stomach turned itself into a fist. Inside, the air smelled of wine and perfume and old paper. Men in fine coats stood in circles, trading opinions louder than they needed to be. Women fanned themselves and watched everything with sharp, careful eyes. Alina found a seat near the back wall, exactly where she had been told to sit, and folded her hands in her lap. She saw him before anyone told her his name. He stood near the fireplace, tall, dressed in black that fit him too well, his expression somewhere between boredom and contempt. When he spoke, the room leaned toward him like plants leaning toward the sun. When he stopped speaking, the silence that followed felt deliberate, as if he had trained it to happen. "Alaric Vane, Duke of Rothmere." A woman beside Alina leaned close and whispered behind her fan. "He humiliated a bishop's son at the spring gathering, made the poor boy stumble over a single line of Virgil until he could not finish a sentence. He does it every year. Find someone new to take apart." Alina said nothing. She watched the Duke move through the room like a blade moving through water, cutting nothing, threatening everything. The evening's game began an hour later. A servant carried out a small wooden box holding folded papers, each one containing a line of Latin text. Guests would be called forward, given a line, and asked to translate it aloud on the spot, with no preparation. The scholars seated at the front table would judge the answer. Rothmere would decide who was called. Alina watched 3 men go before her. 2 stumbled through their lines with red faces and forced smiles. 1 did well enough to earn a polite round of applause. The Duke barely looked up during any of it. His eyes moved over the room the way a hawk's eyes move over a field, searching for something worth his attention. They landed on her. "You," he said, "in the back, the one who has said nothing all evening. Every head in the room turned. Alina felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like a coat 2 sizes too heavy. "I do not believe we have been introduced," the Duke said, and there was something sharp folded inside his polite tone, something that made the room go quiet in anticipation. "Come forward. Let us see if the back row has anything to offer the rest of us." Alina stood. Her legs did not shake, though she had expected them to. She walked to the front of the room, past faces that ranged from curious to amused to openly cruel, and stopped a few feet from the fireplace, facing the Duke. "Your name," he said. "Alina Hartley." "Miss Hartley." He said it the way a man might say the name of a servant who had wandered into the wrong room. "And where did you study? Oxford, Cambridge, or perhaps a fine finishing school where they taught you to embroider handkerchiefs with Latin mottos you cannot actually read?" A few people laughed. Alina did not. "My father taught me," she said, "at home." "How charming." The Duke reached into the wooden box and drew out a folded paper without looking at it, a gesture so casual it was almost an insult in itself. He unfolded it and read the line aloud in Latin, his pronunciation crisp and practiced, the words falling from him like something rehearsed 1,000 times. Then he held the paper toward her, not quite close enough for her to take it easily, forcing her to step forward to reach it. "Translate it," he said, "if you are able." Alina took the paper. She read the line once, silently. She recognized it immediately, not because she had memorized it in some classroom, but because her father had written that exact line in the margin of one of his old books, years ago, with a note beside it about the way translators usually got it wrong. She looked up at the Duke. "You have translated this incorrectly before," she said, "in your own head just now while you were reading it aloud." The room went silent in a different way than before, not the silence of anticipation, the silence of shock. The Duke's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, sharp and sudden. "Is that so?" he said. "The word you are thinking of as conquered does not simply mean conquered here," Alina said. "It carries the sense of being overtaken by something unexpected, something the subject did not see coming. A soldier is conquered by an army, but this line is not about a soldier and an army. It is about a man conquered by his own certainty. The line does not say he was defeated. It says he was surprised by his own defeat." She paused, and in that pause, she felt the entire room holding its breath. "Most translators render it as simple victory," she went on. "But that flattens it. It turns something ironic into something plain. Whoever wrote this line was not describing a battle. He was describing pride meeting its match and not seeing it coming until it was too late." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then from the front table, one of the seated scholars, an old man with silver hair and tired eyes, let out a slow, surprised laugh. "She is correct," he said, looking at Rothmere. "Astonishingly correct. I have read that line 100 times and never once considered it that way." Another scholar nodded slowly, flipping through a small book he had brought with him, comparing her words against a printed translation. "She is right," he confirmed, sounding almost offended by the fact. "The standard translations do get it wrong." The room, which had gathered to watch someone be taken apart, now buzzed with something closer to disbelief. A few people clapped, uncertain at first, then more confidently as others joined in. The Duke stood very still. Alina watched something pass across his face, quick and controlled, gone before most people would have caught it. It was not anger exactly. It was closer to the look of a man who had built a wall his whole life and just watched someone walk straight through it without even trying the door. "A lucky guess," he said finally, his voice even though his jaw was tight. "Perhaps," Alina said. "Or perhaps you assumed nobody in the back row could read past the first meaning of a word." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, quieter this time, careful, aware that they were watching something rare. the Duke of Rothmere humbled in his own salon, by a woman he had summoned forward to embarrass. He did not laugh. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if recalculating something. "Miss Hartley," he said slowly, "where did you say you studied?" "I did not study anywhere," Elinor said. "I told you, my father taught me, at our kitchen table mostly, sometimes by candlelight when we could not afford enough oil to last the whole evening." She had not meant to say the last part. It slipped out, honest and unguarded, and she saw a few of the finely dressed guests exchange glances, the kind of glances that meant they were recalculating who she was and where she belonged in their world. The Duke's expression did not soften. If anything, it grew more focused, more intent, as if she had become a puzzle he had not expected to find in this room. "Return to your seat, Miss Hartley," he said, and though his voice was even, there was something underneath it that had not been there before the exchange began. "I believe the evening has more entertainment planned." Elinor walked back through the crowd, past faces that watched her differently now than they had an hour ago. She sat down in the same chair in the back row, and though nothing about the room had physically changed, she understood, with total certainty, that everything between herself and the Duke of Rothmere had just shifted onto ground she did not fully understand yet. Beside her, the woman with the fan leaned close again. "I have never," she whispered, "in 5 years of attending these gatherings, seen him lose an exchange." "He did not lose," Elinor said quietly, watching the Duke turn back toward the fireplace, his shoulders set in a way that suggested control, though his hands, she noticed, were clasped a little too tightly behind his back. "He simply did not expect to be answered." The evening continued around her, laughter and conversation rising and falling like tide, but Elinor barely heard any of it. Her mind was still on the fireplace, on the man standing in front of it, on the flicker of something unguarded that had crossed his face for less than a second before he buried it again. She had come to that salon expecting to be invisible. Instead, she had been seen, truly seen, by exactly the person she had been warned never to draw attention from. Walking home that night, the cold air biting at her cheeks, Elinor found herself replaying the moment over and over, not the words exactly, but the look on his face. Not embarrassment, not anger, something closer to recognition, as if he had glimpsed, for one unguarded second, someone who understood exactly what it felt like to hide behind certainty because the alternative was too dangerous to consider. She did not know it yet, but she had just made an enemy who was far more interested in her than any enemy should be. And somewhere behind her, in a townhouse still glowing with candlelight, the Duke of Rothmere stood very still by the fire, staring into the flames, turning over in his mind a single sentence he could not stop hearing. He was conquered by his own certainty, and did not see it coming until it was too late. He was no longer certain whether she had been describing the line of Latin or describing him. The next morning, a messenger arrived at Elinor's door carrying a folded card sealed with dark red wax. She turned it over twice before opening it, half expecting an apology, half expecting a warning. It was neither. It was a challenge. The Duke of Rothmere requested the presence of Miss Elinor Hartley at a formal gathering of the finest scholars in the city, 1 week from that day, where she would be asked to translate a text she had never seen before, in front of every person who had watched her humble him the night before. Elinor read the card 3 times. Then she looked toward the shelf where her father's unfinished manuscript sat, wrapped in string, waiting for her to finish what he had started. She folded the card carefully and set it down beside the manuscript, and for the first time since her father died, she felt something other than grief settle into her chest. She felt ready. The week passed slowly, and then all at once. Elinor spent every evening at the kitchen table, surrounded by candle stubs and open books, her father's notes spread out before her like a map of a country only she could read. Edmund watched her from the doorway some nights, saying nothing, bringing her tea she often forgot to drink. "You do not have to go," he told her on the third night. "You could send a note, say you are unwell." "I could," Elena agreed, not looking up from the page in front of her. "But then he would believe I was afraid of him." "Are you not?" Elena set down her pen and looked at her brother properly for the first time that evening. "I am afraid of many things, Edmund. Empty pantries, unpaid fees, growing old in this house without ever once being taken seriously by anyone outside of it. I am not afraid of a duke who cannot stand to be corrected." Edmund almost smiled. Father would have liked that answer. "Father is the reason I have an answer at all," Elena said quietly, and turned back to her books. She did not know what text the Duke intended to give her. That was the entire design of his challenge, to strip away any chance of preparation, to force her into a room with no shield but her own mind. So instead of guessing at passages, she trained the only thing she could train: her instinct, her speed, her ability to hear the shape of a sentence and find its true meaning before her fear had time to catch up with her. Each night she pulled a line at random from her father's shelf, covered the translation with her hand, and forced herself to answer aloud, quickly, the way she would have to in front of a room full of judges. Some nights she was slow and clumsy, tripping over words, frustrated with herself in ways that made her want to give up entirely. Other nights the words came to her clean and certain, and in those moments she understood, with a kind of quiet astonishment, that her father had given her something no university could ever grant. Not knowledge memorized from a professor's mouth. Understanding built brick by brick, at a kitchen table, by two people who loved the same strange old language for the same reasons. On the fifth night, a second letter arrived. This one was not from the Duke. It came from a woman named Margaret Ashford, a name Elena recognized vaguely as one of the wealthier patrons who attended the salon. The letter was brief and careful, written in the tone of someone testing the water before committing to anything further. "I watched what happened between you and the Duke," it read. "I do not know if you understand what you have started. He does not take challenges lightly, and he does not lose gracefully, though he will never admit that losing is what happened. Be careful, Miss Hartley. But also, if I may say so honestly, be brilliant. There are people in that room who have waited a long time to see someone put him in his place, myself included." Elena read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it beside the Duke's card. Two pieces of paper, both circling the same event, both hinting at stakes larger than a simple game of translation. On the sixth night, she could not sleep at all. She sat by the window with her father's manuscript open in her lap, tracing her fingers over his handwriting, the loops and slants of letters he had written 1,000 times before his hand had grown too weak to hold a pen at all. "I wish you were here to tell me I am not foolish," she whispered to the empty room. "I wish you were here to tell me anything at all." The manuscript did not answer her, of course. But somewhere in the quiet of that room, surrounded by his words, Elena felt something settle inside her chest, something steady enough to carry her through what was coming. The seventh evening arrived cold and clear. The gathering was held in a grand hall this time, not the intimate parlor of the previous week, but a room built for spectacle, with high ceilings and rows of seating arranged like a courtroom. Elena understood immediately that this was no longer a private embarrassment contained within one house. This was public. This was designed to be witnessed, discussed, and remembered. She wore the same dress as before, freshly pressed, because it was the only dress she owned that could survive such scrutiny. She walked into the hall with her chin level and her hands steady, though her heart beat hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. The room was already full. Scholars from every corner of the city sat in the front rows, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open skepticism. Word had clearly spread about what happened the week before, and Elena could feel dozens of eyes tracking her movement across the room, weighing her, measuring her, deciding in advance whether they believed what they had heard. The Duke stood near the front, dressed in deep blue this time, his posture perfectly composed, though Alina noticed something tighter in the set of his jaw than there had been the week before. He watched her approach with an expression she could not fully read, something caught between challenge and curiosity, as if he had spent the week turning her over in his mind the same way she had spent it turning over Latin verbs. "Miss Hartley," he said when she reached the front of the hall, "you came. You seem surprised." "I am rarely surprised," the Duke said, "though you appear determined to make a habit of proving me wrong on that account as well." A few scattered laughs rippled through the crowd. Alina allowed herself the smallest smile, though she said nothing. The Duke gestured toward a table where an old scholar sat waiting, a heavy leather book open in front of him. "This is Professor Whitmore. He has selected a passage from a text not widely taught, a passage he assures me is difficult even for those with formal training. You will have no preparation, no assistance, and no opportunity to consult a single reference. You will translate it aloud in front of this room, and these scholars will judge whether your understanding of the language is genuine, or whether last week was, as I suspect, an extraordinary piece of luck." "And if I succeed," Alina said, "what then?" The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly, as if the question itself amused him. "Then I suppose I will owe you an apology I have not offered anyone in a very long time." "And if I fail?" "Then you will have confirmed what most of this room already believes," the Duke said, his voice quieter now, meant only for her. "That intelligence like yours does not come from kitchen tables and candlelight, that it requires walls with names on them, and doors that only certain people are permitted to open." Alina held his gaze. "You do not believe that?" Something flickered behind his eyes again, that same unguarded flash she had seen the week before, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "I do not know what I believe anymore, Miss Hartley," he said, "which is precisely why we are here." Professor Whitmore cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the table. He turned the heavy book toward Alina and pointed to a dense block of Latin text, unfamiliar, tightly packed, the kind of passage that would take most scholars an hour of careful work with reference books at hand. "Whenever you are ready, Miss Hartley," he said. Alina stepped closer to the table. She looked down at the passage. For one long, terrifying moment, the words blurred together into nothing, meaningless shapes on a page, and she felt panic rise in her chest like water filling a room too quickly. Then, somewhere behind her fear, she heard her father's voice, the way he used to talk her through difficult passages when she was younger, patient and steady, never rushing her, always reminding her that Latin was not a code to be cracked but a language to be heard. "Listen to the sentence," he used to say. "Do not translate word by word. Listen to what the whole sentence is trying to tell you, and the words will fall into place around that truth." Alina closed her eyes for a single breath. Then she opened them and began to read. Her voice was steady when she spoke the Latin aloud first, her pronunciation clean and confident, drawing a few surprised glances from the scholars seated closest to her. Then, without pause, without hesitation, she began to translate. The passage was about a soldier returning home from a long campaign, finding his household changed beyond recognition, his family grown older, his home rebuilt in ways he no longer understood. On the surface, it was a passage about homecoming. But as Alina worked through the sentences, she felt the deeper current beneath the words, the grief hidden inside the description, the way the original author had chosen words that suggested loss far more than reunion. "He does not describe joy at seeing his family again," Alina said, her voice growing more certain with each sentence. "He describes displacement. The word here, which most translators render simply as changed, actually carries the sense of something made unfamiliar through the passage of time, something altered so completely that recognition becomes an act of grief rather than comfort. This is not a passage about a happy return. This is a passage about a man discovering that the home he fought to protect no longer exists in the shape he remembers. The hall had gone completely silent. Alina continued, working through each line with growing confidence, her voice filling the enormous room without ever rising above a calm, measured tone. She explained the layered meaning behind word choices that seemed simple on the surface, pointed out where standard translations flattened emotional complexity into plain description, and rebuilt, piece by piece, the true weight of what the ancient author had intended to convey. When she finished, the silence in the room stretched on for several long seconds before Professor Whitmore finally spoke, his voice thick with something that sounded almost like awe. "That is," he said slowly, "the most complete translation of this passage I have ever heard, and I include my own doctoral work in that assessment." A murmur rolled through the crowd, rising quickly into applause, scattered at first, then building into something louder and more sustained. Alina stood very still at the center of it, her heart pounding, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the moment had passed rather than before it. She looked toward the Duke. He was not clapping. He stood perfectly still, watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something stripped bare of its usual armor, something that looked almost like recognition of a person rather than judgment of a performance. "Well, Your Grace," Alina said, her voice carrying clearly through the settling applause, "I believe you owe someone an apology." The Duke did not answer immediately. He simply looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, Alina could not read a single thing behind his eyes. Then he stepped forward, closing some of the distance between them, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond the two of them. "Where did you truly learn to hear language like that?" he asked. "Not the grammar, not the rules, the truth hiding underneath them." Alina thought of her father, of candlelight and unpaid fees, and a kitchen table covered in worn books, of a man who taught her that language was never simply about words, but about the grief and joy and fear that words were built to carry. "From someone who is no longer here to take credit for it," she said quietly, "which is precisely why I intend to keep proving him right." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his composed expression, something that looked almost like the beginning of respect he did not yet know how to offer out loud. "Then I suppose," he said slowly, "we are not finished, Miss Hartley." "No," Alina agreed, feeling the weight of the entire room's attention settle around them like a held breath. "I do not believe we are." News of the second gathering spread through the city faster than Alina could have imagined. Within days, her name was being spoken in places she had never set foot, in drawing rooms and coffee houses and university halls, always attached to the same story, told and retold until it barely resembled the truth. In some versions, she had humiliated the Duke completely. In others, she had merely gotten lucky twice in a row. In every version, her name was no longer simply Alina Hartley. It was becoming something else entirely, a symbol people could argue over. She did not enjoy the attention. She had never wanted to be discussed. She had only wanted, in the smallest and most private way, to prove that the work she and her father had done together meant something beyond the walls of their own home. But attention, once given, does not ask permission before it grows. A week after the second gathering, a letter arrived that was different from anything Alina had received before. It bore a wax seal she did not recognize, heavier and more ornate than the Duke's simple mark. She opened it slowly, aware that whatever it contained would change something. It was an invitation from the Royal Society of Scholars, an organization Alina had only ever read about in newspapers, populated entirely by men who held degrees from the finest universities in the country. The letter explained, in careful and formal language, that word of her recent performances had reached members of the society, and that they wished to extend an invitation for her to appear before their full assembly, where she would be asked to undertake the most difficult translation challenge, the society had ever devised for a single participant. The letter went on to explain that this was not simply an academic exercise. The society intended to open its doors, for the first time in its long history, to the possibility of admitting a member who held no formal university education, provided that member could demonstrate scholarship equal to or exceeding that of its existing membership. Elena read the letter 3 times before she fully understood what it was offering her. Not a party trick, not a private humiliation staged for the entertainment of bored aristocrats. A genuine door, cracked open for the first time in the society's history, waiting to see if she was capable of walking through it. She sat with the letter for a long time before she showed it to Edmund. "This would change everything," he said, reading it slowly, his eyes widening with each line. "Membership in the society, recognition. People would have to take you seriously, Elena. Truly take you seriously, not simply as a curiosity. Or they will use it to destroy me in front of even more people than before," Elena said quietly. "If I fail this time, it will not simply be gossip in a drawing room. It will be recorded, discussed for years, used as proof that women and people without proper education do not belong in rooms like that." Edmund set the letter down carefully. "Are you going to refuse it then?" Elena looked toward the shelf where her father's manuscript sat, the pages she had worked to complete every night for nearly a year, the proof of everything he had given her before he was taken from her too soon. "No," she said, "I am not going to refuse it." The following days passed in a blur of preparation unlike anything she had done before. This was no longer about proving a single duke wrong. This was about walking into a room built entirely to keep people like her out, and demonstrating, beyond any argument, that she belonged inside it. She studied harder than she ever had in her life, pulling apart every text her father had left behind, testing herself on passages she had never encountered, forcing her mind to move faster and more precisely with each passing night. Sleep became something she negotiated with rather than something she simply had. Meals were eaten standing over open books, her attention never fully leaving the pages in front of her. 3 days before the society gathering, the Duke came to her door. Elena opened it herself, since there was no servant to send in her place, and found him standing on the narrow street outside her modest home, dressed simply, without the usual finery he wore in public, as if he had made a deliberate choice not to remind her of the distance between their worlds. "Your Grace," she said, startled, "this is unexpected." "May I come in?" he asked. "Or would you prefer to conduct this conversation on your doorstep, in full view of your neighbors?" Elena hesitated only a moment before stepping aside to let him enter. The house was small, nothing like the grand rooms he was accustomed to, but he did not seem to notice, or if he did, he was careful not to show it. His eyes moved instead to the shelf of books along the far wall, to the manuscript still sitting open on the kitchen table. "Is this it?" he asked, walking toward the table before she could stop him. "The work you mentioned, the one you are finishing for someone who is no longer here?" Elena felt her chest tighten. "It is my father's." The Duke looked down at the pages, his expression unreadable. "May I ask what became of him?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, unsure whether she wanted to answer, unsure whether this man, who had spent their first meeting trying to humiliate her, deserved any part of the truth she carried. "He fell ill 2 years ago," she said finally. "It took him slowly. Near the end, his hands shook too badly to hold a pen, so I began writing for him. He would speak the translation aloud, and I would put it to paper. By the time he died, we had only reached the halfway point of what he intended to complete." The Duke did not offer the kind of hollow sympathy she had grown used to hearing from people who did not truly understand loss. He simply nodded, his eyes still on the manuscript, something unreadable moving behind his expression. "My father died when I was 12, he said quietly, after a long silence. "He was Duke before me. He believed intelligence was the only thing that separated worthy men from unworthy ones, and he tested that belief on me constantly, in front of tutors, in front of guests, in front of anyone willing to watch a boy fail publicly enough to remember the lesson. Alina said nothing, sensing that he was not finished. I learned to never be wrong, he continued, because being wrong in my father's house was not simply an academic failure, it was proof that you did not deserve the name you carried. He looked up from the manuscript, meeting her eyes directly. When you corrected me that first evening in front of that entire room, something in me reacted the way it always has, not to protect my pride, to survive. Survive, Alina repeated softly. You do not understand what it is like, the Duke said, his voice lower now, stripped of its usual careful control, to have spent your entire life believing that the moment you are wrong in public is the moment everyone finally sees the truth, that you were never actually worthy of anything you were given, only worthy of the fear that kept you working hard enough to hide it. Alina felt something shift in her chest, a recognition she had not expected to feel toward this man who had tried twice to embarrass her in front of a room full of strangers. That is not so different from what I have felt my whole life, she said quietly. Only for different reasons. I was never afraid of being wrong because it would expose me as unworthy of a name. I was afraid because being wrong would prove that everyone who told me a woman like me had no place learning Latin at a kitchen table was correct all along. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something unguarded passing across his face, gone before she could fully name it. We are, apparently, he said, more alike than either of us would prefer to admit. Is that why you came here? Alina asked. To tell me that? The Duke was quiet for a moment before answering. I came to warn you about the society gathering. It will not be like the salons you have attended so far. The members of that society have spent their entire lives believing certain doors should remain closed. They will not accept defeat gracefully, and they will use every tool available to ensure you fail, including tools that have nothing to do with fairness. What kind of tools? Alina asked, feeling something cold settle in her stomach. They will select a text designed not to test your understanding, but to expose the gaps in a self-taught education, the Duke said. Obscure grammatical constructions, regional variations rarely taught outside formal university settings. They will attempt to make you fail on a technicality rather than a genuine lack of understanding, because a genuine lack of understanding they could forgive. Proof that their entire system of gatekeeping is built on nothing more than fear disguised as tradition. They cannot. Alina absorbed this slowly, the weight of it settling heavier with each passing second. Why are you telling me this? You are the one who challenged me in the first place. You could simply let me walk into that room unprepared and watch everything I have built collapse. The Duke's jaw tightened, something flickering behind his eyes that looked almost like frustration directed inward, at himself, rather than at her. Because I have spent my entire life watching people be destroyed for the crime of being wrong once, he said, his voice quiet but firm. And I find, much to my own surprise, that I have no desire to watch it happen to you. The words hung in the small room between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared for. Alina felt her pulse quicken, though she could not have said whether it was from fear of the coming trial or from something else entirely, something she did not yet have language for, despite knowing more languages than most people in the city. Then help me prepare, she said finally. If you know what they intend, help me meet it. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and then, for the first time since she had met him, he offered her something that was not scorn, not challenge, not careful aristocratic distance. He offered her his time. Over the following 3 days, the Duke returned each evening, bringing with him rare texts from his own extensive library. Passages written in obscure dialects and unusual grammatical constructions that Alina had never encountered in her father's more limited collection. He drilled her relentlessly, pushing her past what she believed were the limits of her ability, refusing to let her settle for answers that were merely adequate when precision was required. He was, she discovered, an excellent teacher, though he seemed almost surprised by this fact himself. As if teaching required a kind of patience he had never been permitted to develop as a child. "You are better than most scholars I have studied alongside," he told her on the third evening, after she worked through a particularly difficult passage without a single hesitation. "I do not say that lightly." "You say very little lightly from what I have observed," Alina replied, and was rewarded with something rare crossing his face, something that looked unmistakably like a real smile. But beneath the growing ease between them, beneath the late nights spent hunched over old books with candlelight flickering between them, something else was happening, something neither of them named aloud, though both of them felt it building with each passing evening. On the final night before the gathering, the Duke lingered longer than usual after their session had ended. Alina walked him to the door, and he paused there, his hand on the frame, seeming reluctant to leave. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I want you to know that I no longer believe last week was luck." "What do you believe it was then?" Alina asked. The Duke looked at her for a long moment, something vulnerable moving behind his usually guarded expression. "I believe it was proof that I have spent my entire life measuring intelligence by the wrong standard entirely. Degrees, institutions, names carved into stone above university doors. None of it means what I was raised to believe it meant." "And what does it mean in your revised opinion?" Alina asked softly. "I am still working that out," the Duke admitted. "But I suspect it has something to do with candlelight and kitchen tables, and people who teach because they love the truth more than they love their own comfort." Alina felt her breath catch slightly at the way he said it, at the raw honesty underneath words that could have easily remained cold and formal. "Good luck tomorrow, Miss Hartley," he said, stepping back from the doorway, "though I do not believe you require luck at all." He left before she could respond, disappearing down the narrow street into the darkness, leaving Alina standing in her doorway with her heart beating faster than any Latin passage had ever managed to make it beat. She closed the door slowly and returned to the kitchen table, where her father's manuscript still sat open, and for a long moment she simply looked at it, feeling the strange weight of everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks settle over her. Tomorrow she would walk into a room designed to keep her out. Tonight, for the first time since her father died, she did not feel entirely alone in the fight to prove she belonged. The Royal Society's hall was unlike anything Alina had entered before. Marble columns rose toward a ceiling painted with scenes of ancient scholars bent over scrolls, and the air itself seemed heavier here, thick with centuries of tradition, designed to remind visitors exactly how small they were in comparison to the institution surrounding them. Alina stood at the entrance for a moment, gathering herself, before stepping through the tall doors into the main chamber. Rows of seats curved around a central platform, already filled with members of the society, dozens of men in formal academic dress, their faces ranging from mild curiosity to open disdain. At the front of the room sat a panel of 5 senior scholars, the highest-ranking members of the society, each of them holding the power to determine whether Alina would be granted the recognition the invitation had promised, or sent home with her reputation in ruins. She spotted the Duke near the front, seated among the observers rather than the judging panel, since he held no formal scholarly title within the society despite his obvious education. His eyes found hers immediately, and he offered the smallest nod, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Alina drew strength from it and walked to the center of the platform. The eldest member of the judging panel, a stern man named Dr. Pemberton, whose reputation for harsh criticism preceded him, rose slowly from his seat. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent chamber, You have been invited here based on reports of unusual skill demonstrated in less formal settings. The society does not extend membership lightly, and certainly not to those without traditional academic credentials. Today, you will be tested against a standard we do not lower for anyone, regardless of circumstance. I understand, Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady despite the weight of dozens of skeptical eyes fixed upon her. The passage you will translate today, Dr. Pemberton continued, was selected specifically for its difficulty. It contains grammatical structures rarely taught outside advanced university courses, along with regional variations in vocabulary that even experienced scholars find challenging. You will have no assistance, no reference materials, and no opportunity to request clarification. Do you wish to proceed? Eleanor thought of her father, of candlelight, of every late night spent working through difficult passages at their kitchen table. She thought of the Duke's warning, of the careful preparation they had undertaken together over 3 demanding evenings. I wish to proceed, she said. A scholar seated near the panel rose and carried forward a large leather-bound book, opening it to a marked page before setting it on a wooden stand positioned at the center of the platform. Eleanor stepped forward and looked down at the passage. Her stomach tightened immediately. This was more difficult than anything she had encountered in her preparation, denser and more tangled than even the Duke's most challenging examples. The vocabulary alone required careful attention, several words carrying multiple possible meanings depending on regional context, the kind of nuance that could easily trap someone into a technically correct but fundamentally wrong translation. She took a slow breath and began to read. The passage, she realized as she worked through the opening lines, was drawn from an obscure historical account describing a siege, written from the perspective of someone trapped inside a besieged city, watching the world outside grow smaller and more desperate with each passing day. The language was deliberately ambiguous in places, playing with words that could suggest either literal walls or metaphorical isolation, depending on how a translator chose to interpret them. Eleanor understood immediately why this passage had been selected. It was designed to force a translator into choosing one meaning at the expense of the other, when the true skill required recognizing that the author intended both meanings simultaneously, layered together into something richer than either interpretation alone could capture. She began to speak, her voice growing steadier with each sentence. The author is describing more than a physical siege, she said. The vocabulary here is intentionally doubled. When he writes of the walls closing in, he means both the literal fortifications surrounding the city and the psychological weight of isolation pressing down on everyone trapped inside them. A translator who chooses only one meaning misses half of what the author intended to convey. She continued working through the passage, carefully explaining each layer of meaning, pointing out where the regional vocabulary shifted subtly from standard usage, and reconstructing, sentence by sentence, the full emotional and literal weight of what the ancient author had written. The chamber remained utterly silent throughout her translation, the kind of silence that carries its own particular tension, filled with dozens of scholars listening closely enough to catch any error, any hesitation, any sign that her earlier successes had been anything less than genuine understanding. When Eleanor finished, she stood quietly at the center of the platform, waiting. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Dr. Pemberton rose slowly from his seat, his expression unreadable, and turned to consult quietly with the other members of the panel. Their conversation lasted several long minutes, low voices exchanging words Eleanor could not fully hear, though she watched their expressions carefully, searching for any sign of what they had decided. Finally, Dr. Pemberton turned back to face the room. "In my 30 years with this society," he said slowly, "I have heard this exact passage translated by dozens of accomplished scholars. Not one of them recognized the doubled meaning within the description of the walls. Not one of them captured what Miss Hartley has just demonstrated in front of this entire chamber. A murmur rippled through the seated members, some sounding surprised, others sounding almost offended by the admission. "I move," Dr. Pemberton continued, "that this society formally offer membership to Miss Eleanor Hartley, on the grounds that her demonstrated scholarship exceeds the standard we require of any candidate, regardless of the traditional credentials she does not possess." The chamber erupted into a mixture of applause and heated discussion, some members clearly supporting the motion, others visibly resistant to the idea of admitting someone without a university degree into their carefully guarded ranks. The debate continued for several minutes, voices rising and falling around Eleanor as she stood at the center of the platform, feeling strangely disconnected from the argument happening about her future. Eventually, a vote was called. Eleanor watched as hands rose slowly around the chamber, some immediately, others hesitating before finally lifting. The count came back in her favor, though not unanimously. Enough members had voted to admit her that the motion passed, but a significant portion of the room remained visibly displeased with the outcome. Dr. Pemberton addressed her directly. "Miss Hartley, it is my honor to formally welcome you as the first member of this society admitted without traditional university credentials. Your work will, I suspect, be studied and debated for years to come." Eleanor felt something enormous settle in her chest, relief and disbelief and grief all tangled together, because the moment she had worked toward for so long finally arriving felt inseparable from the absence of the one person who should have been there to witness it. Her father should have been there. Instead, she stood alone at the center of a room full of strangers, holding a victory that belonged as much to him as it did to her. She found the Duke waiting for her outside the chamber, standing apart from the crowd of scholars still buzzing with discussion about what had just occurred. "You did it," he said simply, his voice carrying something warmer than she had ever heard from him before. "We did it," Eleanor corrected. "I would not have survived that passage without 3 evenings of preparation I did not ask you to provide." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his expression. "I have spent my entire life believing certain things about intelligence, about worth, about who deserves recognition and who does not. Watching you in that chamber has undone nearly all of it." "That sounds uncomfortable," Eleanor said, allowing herself a small smile. "It is," the Duke admitted, "though I find I do not mind it nearly as much as I expected to." They walked together out of the grand hall, into the cool evening air, and for a while neither of them spoke, simply walking side by side through streets lit by early evening lamplight. "What happens now?" Eleanor finally asked. "For you, for the reputation you built on being impossible to defeat." The Duke was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I suspect my reputation will survive, though perhaps altered into something I understand better than the version I inherited from my father. I no longer wish to be known as a man who destroys people for the crime of being wrong. I would rather be known as someone who recognizes genuine brilliance when he encounters it, regardless of where that brilliance was cultivated." Eleanor looked at him carefully. "That is a significant change, coming from the man who summoned me forward that first evening intending to embarrass me in front of an entire room." "People are capable of change," the Duke said quietly. "Even those of us who were raised to believe change was a form of weakness." They stopped walking near the edge of a small square, lamplight flickering across the cobblestones between them. Eleanor felt the weight of everything that had happened over the past weeks pressing down on her, exhaustion and triumph, and something else entirely, something she was not yet ready to name. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the warning, for the preparation, for treating me eventually as someone worth your genuine effort rather than your scorn." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something vulnerable flickering behind his usually careful expression. "You did not need my effort to succeed today, Miss Hartley. You would have found your way through that passage regardless. I simply wanted the chance to be part of the moment when you did." Alina felt her breath catch slightly at the honesty in his words, at the way he seemed to be offering her something far more delicate than praise. But before she could respond, a voice called out from across the square, sharp and unmistakably hostile, cutting through the quiet evening air. "Rothmere," the voice called, "a word if you would be so gracious." Alina turned to see a tall man approaching, dressed in formal robes marking him as a senior member of the society, his expression tight with barely restrained anger. She recognized him vaguely as one of the members who had voted against her admission. The Duke's posture shifted immediately beside her, something guarded returning to his expression, and Alina understood with sudden clarity that whatever peace had settled over the evening was about to be tested by forces neither of them had fully anticipated. The man who approached them stopped a few paces away, his eyes moving between Alina and the Duke with open suspicion. Alina recognized something in his posture that reminded her uncomfortably of the way the Duke himself had stood on that first evening, all those weeks ago, before anything between them had changed. "Lord Ashcombe," the Duke said evenly, "I did not expect you to follow us from the chamber." "I did not expect to witness the Duke of Rothmere personally coaching a candidate before her admission trial," Lord Ashcombe replied, his voice sharp with accusation. "Several members saw you enter and leave Miss Hartley's residence on multiple occasions this past week. I wonder what the society would make of that information, were it to become widely known." Alina felt her stomach drop. She had not considered, in the exhaustion and focus of preparation, how their evenings together might be perceived by anyone watching from outside. "Lord Ashcombe," the Duke said, his voice hardening slightly, "if you are suggesting that Miss Hartley's admission was somehow improperly influenced, I would remind you that she stood alone on that platform and translated a passage that stumped scholars with 30 years of experience. Nothing I offered her in preparation could manufacture the understanding she demonstrated in that chamber." "Perhaps not manufacture it," Lord Ashcombe said, "but certainly assist it. The Society's rules are quite clear regarding fair and equal preparation for all candidates. If it becomes known that you provided private coaching, using materials from your own extensive library, her admission could be challenged and potentially revoked." Alina felt panic rising in her chest, sharp and immediate. Everything she had worked toward, everything her father's memory represented, suddenly felt fragile, threatened by a rule she had not known existed until this exact moment. "The preparation was my own," Alina said, stepping forward before the Duke could respond further. "The Duke provided texts to practice with, nothing more. The understanding, the instinct, the ability to hear the true meaning beneath difficult grammar, that cannot be taught in 3 evenings. That took years, built at a kitchen table with my father, long before I ever met the Duke of Rothmere." Lord Ashcombe studied her carefully, clearly unconvinced. "A pretty explanation, Miss Hartley, though I suspect the Society's Ethics Committee may wish to examine the matter more closely regardless." "Then let them examine it," Alina said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Let them ask me to translate any passage they choose, with no preparation whatsoever, in front of the entire chamber again. I passed one impossible test already. I am not afraid of another." Something in her tone seemed to give Lord Ashcombe pause. He glanced at the Duke, then back at Alina, his expression shifting slightly, though the hostility did not entirely fade. "That is a bold offer," he said slowly. "It is not boldness," Alina replied. "It is confidence built on years of genuine work, work that no amount of political maneuvering can erase or diminish. If the Society wishes to test me again, I welcome it. But I will not stand here and allow you to suggest that everything I have built was somehow borrowed or improperly gifted, simply because a man who once tried to humiliate me eventually chose to treat me with the respect I had already earned." The square fell silent for a long moment. Lord Ashcombe's jaw tightened, and for a moment Alina believed he might press the matter further. Instead, he offered a stiff, reluctant nod. "I will raise the matter with the committee," he said finally. "Though I suspect, given your evident willingness to be tested again, the concern may resolve itself quickly enough." He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at Alina with something almost grudging in his expression. "For what it is worth, Miss Hartley, your translation today was genuinely remarkable. I simply prefer my institutions to change slowly, if they must change at all." He walked away without another word, disappearing back toward the grand hall, leaving Alina and the Duke standing alone once more in the quiet square. Alina let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her hands trembling now that the confrontation had passed. "I am sorry," the Duke said quietly. "I should have considered how our evenings together might appear to others. I was so focused on ensuring you succeeded that I did not think of the cost it might carry for you." "It is not your fault," Alina said, though her voice shook slightly. "I chose to accept your help. I would choose it again." The Duke looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving behind his expression, entirely different from the careful control he had worn like armor during their very first meeting. "I have spent my entire life protecting myself from moments exactly like the one that just happened," he said slowly. "Being questioned, being accused, being reminded that no matter what I accomplish, someone will always find a reason to diminish it. I built an entire reputation around never allowing anyone close enough to create that kind of vulnerability." "And now," Alina said softly. "And now," the Duke said, "I find that I would rather stand beside you through moments like that one than remain safely alone on the other side of a wall I spent my whole life building." Alina felt her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with Latin passages or scholarly panels. She studied the Duke's face carefully, searching for the scorn she had first encountered weeks ago, the careful cruelty he had used like a weapon against anyone who threatened his composure. She found none of it remaining, only something quieter, steadier, and far more honest than anything he had shown her before. "You called me lucky that first evening," she said. "You called my education a charming fiction, taught by a father who could not possibly have prepared me for a room full of scholars." "I was wrong," the Duke said simply, "about all of it." "You will need to say that in front of the entire society eventually," Alina said, allowing a small smile to return to her face despite the exhaustion of the day. "Not simply to me alone, in a quiet square where nobody else can hear it." "I intend to," the Duke said, "though I confess, saying it to you first felt necessary before I say it to anyone else." They stood together in the lamplight for a long moment, the noise of the city fatting around them, the weight of everything that had happened over the past weeks settling into something that finally felt, for the first time, like it might carry forward into something lasting rather than simply ending with a single triumphant afternoon. In the weeks that followed, Alina's life changed in ways she had never allowed herself to imagine. Her formal admission into the Royal Society opened doors she had spent her entire life believing were permanently closed to someone like her. Scholars who had once dismissed her began seeking her opinion on difficult translations. Publishers approached her about completing her father's unfinished manuscript for wider publication, offering payment that finally allowed her to settle Edmund's outstanding school fees without the constant worry that had shadowed their household for years. She finished her father's manuscript on a quiet evening in late autumn, sitting at the same kitchen table where they had worked together for so many years. When she wrote the final line, translating the closing passage her father had never lived to complete, she felt his presence in the room as strongly as she ever had, not as grief, but as something closer to gratitude. The Duke visited often during those weeks, though never with the same formal distance he had once maintained. He came instead as someone genuinely interested in her work, in her opinions, in the small details of her life that had nothing to do with Latin or scholarship at all. He learned slowly how to laugh without guarding himself against the vulnerability laughter required. She learned, in turn, that the careful, cold reputation he had built around himself was only ever a shield, constructed by a frightened boy who had never been permitted the safety of being simply human in front of anyone who mattered. One evening, several months after her admission into the society, the Duke arrived at her door carrying a small, worn book, its spine cracked from age, clearly well read. "I found this in my father's library," he said, handing it to her carefully. "It is the very text you translated at that first society trial. I marked the passage." Alina opened the book to the marked page, the same passage about the besieged city, the walls closing in both literally and figuratively. Beside the printed Latin, in careful handwriting she recognized as the Duke's own, was a note. "I was wrong to believe that walls only ever kept people out. Sometimes they simply protect what has not yet learned it is safe to be found. Thank you for finding me anyway." Alina looked up at him, her eyes suddenly bright with unexpected emotion. "You wrote this?" "I did," the Duke said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "I am not skilled at saying difficult things aloud. I thought perhaps you would understand it better written in the margins of a book, the way you understand everything else." Alina closed the book gently and set it on the table beside her father's completed manuscript, two pieces of proof, side by side, that language could carry more truth than most people ever allowed it to hold. "I understand it perfectly," she said softly. The Duke reached out, his hand finding hers across the small kitchen table, the same table where she had spent countless evenings translating grief and hope and everything in between, the same table where her father had taught her that words were never simply words, but vessels carrying entire lives inside them. "Alina," he said, using her given name for the first time without any title attached to it. "I do not know precisely what this is between us, or where it will lead. I only know that I do not wish to face whatever comes next without you beside me." Alina looked at him, at the man who had once tried to humiliate her in front of a room full of strangers, who had since become someone she trusted with the quietest, most guarded parts of her own history. "Then perhaps," she said, "we should stop worrying about what to call it and simply continue finding out together." Outside, the evening settled over the city, lamplight flickering against cobblestones, carrying the same quiet steadiness that had carried Alina through every difficult passage she had ever faced. Inside the small kitchen, surrounded by books and candlelight and the unfinished business of two people slowly learning to be honest with each other, something new had begun, something neither grand titles nor formal degrees could fully explain, though Alina suspected, if pressed, she could have found exactly the right words for it anyway. She simply chose, for once, to let the moment speak for itself.